Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Thanks for joining me today. Today's topic is George Washington Part 1. When I was in high school at Rocky River High School in Rocky River, Ohio, I took a class with a teacher named Vernon Gillespie, Eastern Civilization, later Russian History, another class. And Mr. Gillespie was an outstanding teacher. And from his class I developed a love of history. In his class, he was very clear and sequential and very knowledgeable, and a very good man, and did a very good job. And I have found over the years history to be very interesting, very entertaining, very inspiring and empowering. I became a history major at Duke University, and I became a high school history teacher myself. So for me, history, aside from the fact that it is interesting and entertaining, I think it's also a matter of respect. The world didn't start when we were born. And the people from the past who were born and lived and worked and contributed and died should be remembered. What they did for us, because we are the beneficiaries of their work. Yes, they made mistakes, and we can learn from those mistakes, but we should also see the good and recognize what they did. Now, I was born in the United States, lived for many years in the Philippines, and I believe both countries are wonderful countries. Now, this topic is about the United States. I believe the United States is a good country, and we should, as Americans today or immigrants today in the United States, we should recognize and pay respects to those who have lived in the past and who made this very nice country, very good country for us to live in today. So actually Mr. Gillespie, he was in the National Geographic magazine, January 1965. I heard later from my friend Brent Lesheim, because he served in the U.S. military in the Vietnam War with the Montagnard people in South Vietnam. He was working with them, trying to get their support for the American cause and that of South Vietnam. He never told us about that. He was a very humble man, very good man. So, today's topic, as I said, is George Washington Part 1, the first President of the United States. George Washington's profile is on the quarter coin. His face is on the $1 bill, and in my opinion that should be changed to the face from the portrait at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I think it's a better likeness of him, in my opinion. Okay, his face, his head is chiseled in stone at Mount Rushmore, South Dakota, with Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. The capital of our country, Washington, D.C., is named after George Washington. And then, of course, the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., which is an obelisk 555 feet 5 inches tall, there in Washington, D.C. Washington State is also named after him. He is the father of our country. When the War of Independence came, the American Revolution, we were 13 English colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America. And the people at that time considered themselves or thought of their country as either England or Great Britain, because we were a British colony, or the colony they lived in, like Virginia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York. But they didn't see themselves as one people, as the American people. George Washington was the man who really started or helped unify those colonies and helped those people to see themselves as one people, the American people. He was the commander of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War for 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention when the 13 states, which were independent of each other, we were like 13 countries, but we became one country when the U.S. Constitution became law. And George Washington was the president of that convention. He served as the first president for 8 years, from 1789 to 1797. In my opinion, George Washington, his life and character is the foundation of the American nation. And he's the most important person in American history, and certainly deserving of our study. Now, if we go back in time to the early part of the 1700s, the 18th century, actually even back further, 1607, the first English settlers arrived in Massachusetts and Virginia. So by 1720, they had been there for, English colonists had been there for more than 100 years. The population of those colonists rose from 1720 to 1750 from 445,000 to 1.2 million. So there's a big population growth. Still very small numbers compared to today. We have like more than 300 million people in the U.S. today. But the population was going up primarily due to good food. The children were surviving childhood, and very often malnourishment is a cause of death with young children. In 1656, John Washington, George Washington's great-grandfather, arrived in America. He was a sailor on a ship that ran aground, had needed repairs on the Potomac River in Virginia, and that took time to fix that ship. And during the time they were fixing the ship, John Washington thought, wow, this looks like a good place to live. He decided to stay. And after 20 years, he owned 5,000 acres in Virginia, including the land where George Washington's famous home of Mount Vernon was eventually built. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732. That means he was born on 2/22/32. So his birthday is 2/22. That reminds me of the old TV show Room 222. Anyway, he was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia. And that Westmoreland County, that reminds me of General Westmoreland from the Vietnam War. He was born at Pope's Creek Farm. His parents were Augustine, also known as Gus Washington. His mother was Mary Ball Washington. Both his father and his half-brother Lawrence studied at the Applebee School in Westmoreland, England. Interesting. Makes me think of the Applebee's restaurants today. So if next time you're at Applebee's, just think of George Washington's father and brother, and that was their alma mater. Now, he had a number of siblings. He had 9 siblings, and he was close to his brother Jack, was one brother. He had a brother Sam who was a profligate he tried to help. His father had 2 families. His father was married, his first wife died, and he had 3 children with his first wife, Lawrence, Augustine Jr., and Jane. And then his wife died. He remarried George's mother, Mary, and had 5 children with her. George was the oldest. And then there was Betty, Sam, Jack, Charles, and Mildred. His mother, Mary, was a very thrifty woman, very hardworking, and she was known to rise with the sun, which is the farmer's habit. She was a rather difficult woman, and she relied on George quite a bit, and she considered George a bad son, actually. She never really agreed with what he was doing, especially during the Revolution, because, you know, you have to remember, a lot of people were British loyalists who thought, what are we doing? Why are we fighting the British? We shouldn't be doing this. We can't win. And the British weren't that bad anyway. It's not like the British, you know, were brutalizing the colonists like other colonies, like the Belgian Congo, or like the Spanish colonies in Latin America. So anyway, you know, it was controversial, the war itself. And, you know, she thought, you know, she didn't agree with him. George Washington's mother considered him a bad son. That's kind of interesting. Now, he was closest among his siblings to his stepbrother, Lawrence, who was 12 years older. And Lawrence had served in the British Navy. He'd seen action fighting the Spanish in the Caribbean. And his commanding officer on his ship was a man named Admiral Vernon. And that's where, and Lawrence built Mount Vernon, named after his commanding officer, Admiral Vernon. And then George kept the name when he eventually acquired that property. So after 3 years, the family moved to this location where Mount Vernon was built, 1735, Little Hunting Creek Farm. There were no other children around there besides his siblings, and he helped as he got older with farm work. His father, besides the farm there, had an iron mine and an iron works 30 miles away. It's where he was mining iron and fashioning, making iron and making things needed in farming, like ends of a pitchfork or the ends of a shovel and different things for farming. So George didn't see him very much during those years. Finally, he moved the family moved to, in 1738 when George was 6, to what was called the Ferry Farm near his ironworks on the Rappahannock River across from Fredericksburg. George was homeschooled. Now, it's possible he went to a school. There are no records of him going to school. His favorite subject was mathematics, and that actually, led him to his first career, which was as a surveyor. Now, when he was 11, his father died, got sick and died, and so this was pretty hard, losing his father at a young age. And so Lawrence became like a second father to him, this stepbrother who was 12 years older. One of George's favorite books growing up was Don Quixote by Cervantes, which I think is a wonderful classic novel translated from the Spanish, which I've read and enjoyed very much. George was not an intellectual. He pretty much worked his whole life. In fact, from childhood up until a few days before his death. And his schooling came to an end when he was 15, because the father had died, and his mom needed him to work to support her and his younger siblings. So that meant there was no Applebee college for George. On the farm, they had tobacco, fruit, grain, vegetables, and George had a lifelong love of horses. He loved the outdoors. He's a very strong man, very physically strong, and he loved to dance. He loved hunting. He loved fishing and boating. Those were some of his interests. Now, his character, George Washington was very sober. He was quiet. He had a strong personality. He was very patient. He was humble. His humility was very important, very helpful. Very hard-working man, and very brave and patriotic. So he started working when he was 15. He began a surveying career, which he did for 6 years, and he helped with the surveying of what became the city of Alexandria. He also became the official surveyor of Culpeper County. And that reminds me of Dante Culpeper, whom the Cleveland Browns, the team I support, could have drafted in 1999, and but they didn't. That's the life of a sports fan. Anyway, so Washington made good money as a surveyor, and by the time he was 18, he owned 1,500 acres of land. Okay. So he grew as he grew. When he became an adult, he was 6'2", and he had a good posture, very strong. During his lifetime, he lost all but one tooth. Now, it's a myth that he had wooden dentures. He did have dentures, but they were made out of, there were several different kinds he had. One was made out of human teeth, another of ivory, another of lead. Now, when he was 19, Lawrence got sick. His older brother, like the second father for him, and he had tuberculosis. So it was decided the two of them traveled to Barbados in the Caribbean, hoping for a cure for Lawrence. Now, in Barbados, George developed smallpox, a mild case, and he survived, he recovered, and he gained immunity. And during the American Revolution, he was immune to the smallpox epidemics that broke out that killed a lot of men, and that was helpful. And he became a believer in inoculation. That was the only foreign trip he took in his life, to Barbados. And while he was there, he studied farming. Farming actually was his lifelong love and you could say his life's work. The following year, Lawrence died, and so that was pretty tough. He'd lost his father, he lost his second father, and as a result, he inherited Mount Vernon. Okay, the famous home that we're all familiar with, which is near Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River. That same year, George, he was a young man, he was 20 years old, and he was, interested in proving himself, showing that he was brave. And, the military career is always appealing to young men who are strong and brave and so forth. And so he enlisted in the British Army, specifically the Virginia Militia. The following year, Virginia governor, this English governor, Robert Dinwiddie, sent George on a mission to western Pennsylvania. Now the French were moving into Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, from Canada, from French Canada, from Quebec. And the Americans, the English colonists, were coming from Virginia west and up into the Ohio Valley. And so there was a conflict, and Great Britain and France were the two superpowers of that time. They were fighting each other, and they fought in Europe, they fought in India and Africa and so forth. And anyway, his mission, Washington's mission, was to meet with the French and tell them they had to get out, that western Pennsylvania was English territory. So this was a big adventure for him, and he actually volunteered. It was a 300-mile trip. And he went to Fort LaBeouf, which is near Lake Erie. Reminds me of Shia LaBeouf, the actor. And then the French said, well, we don't care what you say. We're here. We're not just going to leave. But anyway, he delivered his message and returned back to Virginia. He had a number of escapades. He fell in a cold river, and had incidents with Indians. At that time, there was not only the struggle between the English and the French, but there were the Indian allies on both sides where there was fighting. Washington arrived at the juncture where the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River join to form the Ohio River. Okay, and Washington passed through there, and he thought, well, this would be a good place to build a fort. And that actually is where the city of Pittsburgh grew up and developed. And the land where Washington passed was where Three Rivers Stadium was built. And I think it's now Heinz Field, where in the old days where the Pittsburgh Pirates played baseball and the Pittsburgh Steelers played football. I was a big fan as a kid in the 70s, and the Steelers won 4 Super Bowls in the 70s. And boy, were they good. They were a tough team. They still are actually now. But anyway, I was imagining George Washington walking across the field, because he walked across what became the football field. So I imagine Washington walking across the field and Terry Bradshaw moving the Steelers up and down the field in the 1970s. Of course, that's still true today. Anyway, after Washington left, the French built their own fort right there. It was a good idea that he had. Oh, and by the way, the Cleveland Browns fans who are very much against Pittsburgh, I think that's wrong, because Pittsburgh is on the Ohio River, and Pittsburgh became the place where people came to, a very important place, because when you travel by land from the Atlantic coast, once you get to Pittsburgh, you're on the Ohio River, which connects to the Mississippi River system. And back, especially in the old days before automobiles and trains and so forth, river travel was the best way to move quickly inland. So we should respect Pittsburgh for its important place in American history, and the fact it's on the Ohio River. And here in Cleveland, we live in the state of Ohio. Anyway, Washington, he survived this ordeal. You know, he could have died. It was a big adventure, and this kind of raised his esteem in Virginia. Yeah, he was shot at by horses and so forth. Okay, so the following year, Washington was sent back with a small number of soldiers to make the British presence felt in western Pennsylvania. And George Washington built Fort Necessity, some distance south of Fort Duquesne, and which is, you know, remember Fort Duquesne became where Pittsburgh was built. He built Fort Necessity, but he didn't. The English forces weren't very well fortified. It was kind of a flimsy fort, and the French and their Indian allies attacked. And Washington was forced to surrender on July 4th, 1754. And so this was, you know, obviously a big disappointment, and he was allowed to leave. They went back to Virginia, but it was a very painful, humiliating experience. Now this was depicted in a Simpsons episode, where Bart Simpson, the teacher said, well, now Bart, if you fail this last test, you're going to fail the 4th grade, so you better study. So he studied and studied and studied. He stayed, you know, and he even dreamed about George Washington. And Washington was singing in his dream on the Simpsons episode, "We're going to party like it's 1799. Anyway, Bart went to school the next day, took the test, got a 59, which was failing. He failed the test. So the teacher said, Bart, I'm sorry, you failed the test. You failed the 4th grade. You're going to have to repeat 4th grade. So Bart was, you know, very, very upset. So he started crying. He said, oh, I feel terrible. I feel so bad. I feel just like George Washington when he surrendered to the French at Fort Necessity in 1754.
Who am I kidding? I really am a failure. Oh, now I know how George Washington felt when he surrendered Fort Necessity to the French in 1754.
What?
Oh, you know 1754, the famous defeat of the French. Oh.
My God, Bart, you're right.
Gosh, Bart, that's incredible. I'm going to give you extra credit. I'm going to give you an extra point, which means you passed the test and you've passed the 4th grade. So, anyway, the following year, the British decided to send a much larger contingent, a much larger army to western Pennsylvania. Now, George was becoming somewhat disgruntled in his service. There was discrimination against Americans, and he thought, well, he was getting demoralized. Anyway, he was involved. He was with General Edward Braddock on when this large British force came into western Pennsylvania, and it turned into a disaster. The French and their Indian allies attacked, and there were I think 1,000. There were 1,000 casualties, 1,000 killed and wounded. And Daniel Boone was actually on that mission. So this was a real tragedy and a defeat. Now General Braddock was killed, and Washington had to assume some leadership during the retreat. Braddock was buried under the road, hoping because they thought the Indians might desecrate his body. During this time, during that mission, George got a letter from his mother and asking, complaining that he was neglecting her and saying that, and asking him to buy her some butter. And he wrote back, he said, well, Mom, I'm sorry, I'm real busy and I can't buy you any butter. So, anyway, that was pretty funny. Now, during that battle, when the British attacked, there was a story told about an Indian chief who said this about that battle. Quote, I called to my young men and said, mark you, tall and daring warrior, he is not of the redcoat tribe. He hath an Indian's wisdom, and his warriors fight as we do. Himself is alone exposed. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which but for him knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power Mightier far than we, shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle. The Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. Now, if you believe in God, if you believe that the United States is a good country, as I do, I believe in God, I believe the U.S. is a good country, and I believe God loves us, and I believe the United States is a power for good in the world. And therefore, it would make sense to me that George Washington would stay alive, because he had a very important mission to fulfill. And at that battle with General Braddock, Washington was shot, his horses were shot several times, he got bullets through his clothing and so forth. The following year, in 1758, the British came back again and finally defeated the French, and they took the land that became Pittsburgh, and they built their own Fort Pitt. So Washington was a part of what became a victorious time, when western Pennsylvania was secured for English forces. Now in 1759, Washington was tired of his, he felt he had no future in the British Army, so he resigned. He thought, you know, I'm an American. I cannot become, you know, a general. So big changes came to him. He resigned from the Army. He went back to, he had a large farm. He spent the next 16 years farming. And he did own slaves. We can't deny that. It's true. He owned slaves. The same year he married a young widow named Martha Dandridge Custis, who had 2 young children. And it was one of the best decisions he ever made, because she was a very, very good woman, very helpful to him. And they had a very good marriage. And his success was due in large part to her help, her support, her love, her friendship, and so forth. Around that same time, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, so he got into politics, and that's the legislative body in Virginia, and where they served in Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia. He met people like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, and he was living his life at Mount Vernon. And so this is what he was doing. He was farming, he had this married life, and he was in politics. So he was trying to make a living. He was having trouble with tobacco. He switched to wheat. He had a flour mill. He used to fish commercially in the Potomac River and produced barrels of salted fish. And for fun, he enjoyed going on fox hunts, which were a big social affair at that time. Now back then in politics, you had to provide the voters with rum if you wanted them to vote for you. So in his first election in 1758, Washington supplied 160 gallons of rum to convince the voters to vote for him, and they did, and he was elected. Now among his hounds, which he used in his fox hunting, the names of several included Pompey, Vulcan, and that reminds me of Spock from Star Trek, Rover, Truman, Jupiter, Old Harry, and Truelove. So he had a hound named Old Harry and another one named Truman. Harry Truman, who was a president later. As I said, Martha was a wonderful woman. She described herself as, quote, an old-fashioned Virginia housekeeper, steady as a clock, busy as a bee, and cheerful as a cricket. She had a very positive spirit. She spent an hour every morning praying and reading the Bible. And Washington was, they were very devoted to each other. Now Washington had this to say about farming, quote, I think that the life of a husbandman, the farmer, is of all others the most delectable. It is honorable, it is amusing, and with judicious management it is profitable. To see plants rise from the earth and flourish by the superior skill and bounty of the laborer fills the contemplative mind with ideas which are more easy to be conceived than expressed. The more I am acquainted with agricultural affairs, the better I am pleased with them. I can nowhere find so great satisfaction as in those innocent and useful pursuits. So Washington loved farming, being outdoors, the physical aspect, and wasn't an easy thing to make a living in farming. In 1763, British King George III proclaimed all land west of the Appalachian Mountains closed to American settlers. Now this violated promises to English veterans of the wars with the French, including George Washington. So his land claims were nullified by that order. So that was a step toward war, a step toward the American Revolution. In 1855, the Stamp Act was passed, a tax on all documents. And this was another step toward war, the beginning of trouble. And people thought, we don't have representation in Congress, so why are we being taxed? Okay, we're almost done here. In 1769, Lord Beaudort, the Virginia governor, dismissed the Virginia legislature after they protested new taxes in the Townshend Acts. And Washington met with other legislators in the Williamsburg Tavern. They decided to boycott British goods. So, thanks for watching. Next time we'll continue with this story in part 2, which is the American Revolution and George Washington's very important role. Thanks so much for watching today. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. God bless you. God bless the Philippines, America, and the whole world. See you next time.